Hall & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hi, and welcome to another episode in our Risk Ready podcast, focusing on the retail industry. My name's Nicole Tomiati, and I'm a partner in the corporate and commercial team at Hall & Wilcox, and I also head up our retail and consumer goods group. I'm joined by my partner, Jackie Barrett, who is also a partner in the corporate and commercial team, and also has a lot of experience working with businesses in the retail sector. Jackie, as you're aware, we're seeing a rise in insolvencies in the retail sector. What are some of the reasons you attribute that to?
Thanks, Nicole. I'm really happy to be here. There's a lot going on for retail at the moment. I think we're reading about it in the news. We're seeing lots of reports of really a challenging economic environment that is impacting. And so what I'm hearing from my clients, particularly in areas of retail where it would be a discretionary spend. So by that, I mean, it might be a luxury good, it might be something special, but it's not something that is an essential item. With, that fall in consumer spending, the cost of living pressure, rising interest rates, that is definitely having a big impact on clients that we're working with and across the sector, I think, in terms of being able to attract enough customers and secure their flow of revenue. And so that's one issue. Another issue that's coming up a lot is, of course, I think, reduced spend from customers means you perhaps don't need as much warehousing space. And so the operational costs associated with the business are becoming an issue. So particularly lease costs. So if you have a space that is supposed to support a particular level of sales, and then you're not getting the on sales that you're expecting, you then have this massive burden of a lease. A lot of clients have long-term leases, and so it's very hard for them to manage the costs associated with that and to be able to continue to be solvent. And so it's a frustrating outcome because we have a scenario where probably the business is doing actually really quite well and on its own would be able to survive and function in this environment. But then those operational costs, and I'm using lease as one example, are placing a really difficult burden on the company.
That's pretty consistent with what I've been seeing as well. And I think all the things that you've talked to really have an impact on cash flow, and those businesses particularly businesses that are really highly leveraged, I think are finding the current environment quite challenging.
Yeah. And I think the other one that is interesting, and if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said supply chain issues are arising more associated with the outcome of restrictions arising from COVID. But now we have conflicts in numerous parts of the world. A lot of retailers do source goods from overseas. They're managing increased production costs. There are delays and higher costs of shipping. And so that's another issue that's impacting, I think, in this area, and that's putting more pressure on our retail sector that then would be desirable.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the things you mentioned as well, they'll be true of both, your traditional bricks and mortar businesses, but also your online businesses as well, even though they might not have as much a physical footprint as the physical retail spaces. I think a lot of the supply chain issues, customer spending, that similarly impacts online businesses as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also growing risks like cyber risk, cyber fraud, all of those things, whether it's online or you're hybrid, because most businesses these days would have some online element, that is also putting a cost pressure on the business that they may not otherwise have had to deal with. So they obviously have to get the right software to make sure that they minimise those sorts of issues, but then insurance costs. So everything adds up. And I think that's an interesting one. And I know we were chatting about this around retail crime as well.
Thanks, Jackie. That's really insightful in terms of what we're actually seeing the pressures our clients are experiencing in the retail sector. What have you been seeing in terms of clients who are doing things well to mitigate those risks, or managing the challenges they're experiencing well at the moment?
Yeah. I think, clients are being very resourceful and innovative in trying to manage some of these issues. The things that we're seeing, of course, there are, I think, standard things that every retail business should be looking at when times are tight, re-examining your contracts with suppliers and with customers if needs be, making sure that you're not, to the extent you have risk. So, for example, if you've given security for supply arrangements, that they are on reasonable terms, that they're manageable, and you're aware of your exposure in that regard. So that's one thing, but I just think that's something that a prudent business would be really alert to and aware of in the running of their business. Other things that our clients are looking at is moving away from bricks and mortar. So they're pivoting into more online offerings. And so that obviously does create opportunities to reduce costs around managing an actual physical space. Also reduces the risk of theft and crime, but it also creates efficiencies, and it creates opportunities for the client to target a broader market, and that market may even go beyond Australian borders. So it definitely creates new opportunities and helps them hopefully attract a whole new customer base in relation to their goods or services.
Mm-hmm.
The other one that is just a practical step is a lot of our clients are starting to be really heavily scrutinise their stock and to clear out obsolete stock and manage their stock better so that they can be more effective in how they use their space, and also and just really move stock on that they're not using. Another one that a lot of my clients have done recently is, so they might have multiple streams of their business, and so they will really just identify the two key business streams that are the most productive and bring in the most revenue and the most work, and then they will refine and streamline that business. So they may actually move away from certain revenue streams because they're not as productive, and they may sell those assets on, or they might just shut them down. But that does help the business continue to function and really focus on what they're good at. But another take on it is some of our clients are looking at buying complementary businesses. So they may secure their supply chain. They may create new opportunities to grow their business by buying complementary businesses that they can work with really well and expand their business operations. So I've seen a little bit of that. So a lot of our clients are looking to renegotiate their lease arrangements, and typically that would be quite difficult because it is often the case that landlords are not particularly sympathetic to those situations. But in some of the sectors, it seems that there's more opportunity, or the retail business has more leverage, and that's because there's changes in the way people are doing business. There might be more space in particular shopping centres, for example, and so some of our clients are having a bit of success in renegotiating their lease terms so that they're more manageable. But I think that's a hard one because people get tied into leases often for long periods, and it can be hard if the landlord, particularly if the landlord doesn't have an alternative, so that it's not, there's not a queue of people lining up for that space, it can be hard to negotiate on those points. But it is certainly worth considering. At a minimum, it's worth understanding your exposure, because that, I think, keeping on top of what your costs are, where you're exposed, how you're managing financially is super important. And so part of that is being aware of what your exposure is under leases and contracts, and managing your costs so that, if something were to happen, or something unfortunate were to happen, you at least be ready to respond and act quickly, because I think we've got to bear in mind that, if you are running a business and you're a director, so you're running it perhaps through a company, you are exposed as a director to ensure that the company is not trading insolvent. And so, if you do allow the company to trade insolvent, there are really significant personal consequences for you as a director under the Corporations Act for allowing that to happen. And so I would definitely counsel keeping on top of all of those costs and understanding what is happening in your business so that you can be alert to respond and to manage those issues as they come up.
So listening to you talk about things your clients are doing, if there's a theme I can pull out from that, it sounds like those clients who are really critical and analysing their business and where the risks are and what their exposures are, but also forward planning in ways that they can mitigate those risks and think and take advantage of opportunities as they arise, whether it be, a strategic M&A, having a good understanding of your business and what parts of those business are profitable and what's parts perhaps don't relate to core business, understanding what those are such that you're in a good position if an opportunity arises to dispose of those or undertake a transaction, whether it be a disposal or an acquisition, even if it's, you want to shore up some supply chain.
Nicole, I think that's a really good theme to adopt, is this idea of trying to anticipate what might happen in the business, do some future thinking and forward planning, keep on top of issues. And as part of that, because not everyone is an expert in finances and not everyone's an expert in accounting, so it's important that you bring in the right people to help you. So working with your accountant, working with your tax advisor, keeping on top of those sorts of issues so that you are ready to respond if there is a problem or you need to make a change quickly. And so I think wide consultation is always helpful. So seek out other opinions and support, because, apart from anything else, is, can be extremely stressful. So having people who might be able to help you navigate that is always helpful. One other thing I was going to mention is that it is often the case in a scenario where the economy is not doing well, there's pressure on the business, you're worrying about lots of different things in running a business, is that it creates pressure on business relationships you might have. And so what I've seen in recent years is a bit of a trend where disputes start happening within the business. And so that might be between two founders, or you might have issues with key management personnel and owners. And so that's another area I think to look at. A lot of businesses are run through companies, and it's, depending on the size of the business, this may not be an issue, but it's often the case that you have multiple parties who have interests, whether that's shareholders or, of course, directors. And so I think another good thing to do, particularly if you're worried about that, or, things are starting to look a little bit fragile, or there are a few more disputes or arguments, understand your relationship with the company and as between the shareholders. And ideally you would have a shareholder agreement in place to help manage that, but it would be good to revisit that and be on top of how you would proceed. For example, if you needed to part ways, or you needed to manage a dispute or an argument as between key shareholders or directors. And so what I've seen and what we've helped clients with in more recent years to avoid actually moving into an insolvency situation is restructuring the business so that you might have an exit, but you also then have revisited the shareholder agreement. You've agreed key points around how the business will be managed, how you will deal with issues, how you'll deal with disputes. All of those sorts of things are covered. But you also then work with your bank and you might restructure financially. And so there are, various opportunities to hopefully clean up issues and then be able to keep running the business really effectively without sort of falling into an insolvency situation.
Yeah, and you mentioned, getting the right experts involved. And, if you are considering a restructure, I suppose that's where talking to a turnaround expert or, a tax expert, just to make sure that, if there are any changes to your structure, that it's done in a tax effective way. So I can see that that'd be really key, getting them, and I suppose getting the right people involved early. And I suppose that's where being proactive, understanding your business, looking at it critically, and knowing, being honest about where perhaps some of your strengths don't lie, and you do need to bring in that support. So that's something we'd obviously recommend, whether it be lawyers, tax advisors, accountants, or turnaround specialists. Reaching out to the right people can be really essential to a business when they're suffering financial difficulty.
Yeah, I agree, Nick. And I think particularly what I would also counsel is generally that first conversation people are very willing to have, and they really want to help. And so it's not so much a big cost issue. It's about, particularly I found with turnaround specialists, just having that initial ability to talk through the issues and to sort of get a direction or a sense of what might be the best course of action. And just talking to a turnaround specialist does not mean that you'll suddenly be in a position where you have to declare insolvency or other issues. But it is, I think, they're very experienced, of course, in seeing that side of things, but they're also very experienced in helping businesses restructure or work their way or make improvements to ensure that they can keep working and operating the way they want to.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point also too, in terms of when you're thinking about your vulnerabilities, it might be that your particular business is going fine at the moment, but you might be vulnerable to your suppliers or to customers, those entities being in financial difficulty. And when it's it's a difficult economic market, that's more likely to happen. So again, it comes back to forward planning and understanding what the risks are and in which ways you're vulnerable, but also being prepared if something does go wrong, because you might be going fine now, but things can change quickly if the businesses around you that you rely on are in financial difficulty.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think obviously there's lots that we could say, and we could talk a lot longer about these issues, Nick. But I think for the purpose of this podcast, if I were making a plan, my big takeaway would be to make a plan. So make sure you're on top of what your business is doing, be aware of all your contractual relationships, keep on top of what's happening in your sector so that you can hopefully be apprised of changes that may impact your business. But make a plan and seek out advice where appropriate.
No, thank you, Jackie. That's great. And thank you, everyone, for listening today. As always, please get in touch with us if you have any questions. You can find our details on our website, which is hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, then rate, review, or subscribe to our podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.